On my 18th birthday, my stepmom forced my dad to kick me out to make space for her baby. Later, I discovered they had stolen money from my late mother's wealthy family, and I refused to return. Lately, things have been rough between me and my father. I turned 18 just last week, and instead of celebrating, I found myself being told to pack my things and leave. My dad decided that now was the perfect time to kick me out. My mother passed away in an accident when I was just 3 years old. After that, my dad went through a string of relationships, never staying single for long. As a child, I hardly ever saw him without a woman around. He was always with someone. During the day, when he was at work, I had a nanny taking care of me, but the moment he came home, he had a girlfriend by his side. After my mom's passing, he cut all ties with her family. He did not see the point in staying in touch, and I assumed they did not push for custody because they did not want a painful reminder of what they had lost. That left me alone with my dad, though, to be honest, he never seemed too interested in raising me. His life revolved around work and whatever woman he was dating at the time. I did everything I could to connect with him when I was a kid, but no matter how hard I tried, I never got the love or attention I wanted. He provided what was necessary, but nothing more. After a while, I just stopped expecting anything from him. My childhood was lonely, but I was lucky to have my grandfather. He would visit often, and for the most part, he was the only family I had that actually cared about me. Unfortunately, my grandfather could not take me in. My father refused to give up custody for reasons I still do not understand. He was distant and cold, but never outright cruel, at least not when I was younger. Maybe that was why my grandfather never pushed for legal custody. There was no clear abuse, just neglect. He visited me as much as he could, and I would go to his house whenever my dad allowed it. But even then, my father made sure that my visits were never longer than 3 or 4 days. He was strict about it, though I never understood why. As I grew older, I started rebelling. I wanted to spend more time with my grandfather, and I did not see why I should not be allowed to. Unlike my dad, my grandfather treated me with kindness. He made me feel like I mattered. But my father would not budge. Every time I tried to bring it up, he shut me down, telling me that at the end of the day, he was my father and his word was final. My grandfather tried, over and over again, to convince my dad to be more involved in my life, but nothing changed. He also suggested letting me move in with him, but my father refused. I had no choice but to stay. Our relationship hit its lowest point during my teenage years, and then it got even worse when he met Veronica. Veronica, who was 28, had been staying with our neighbor while she waited for her job to sort out her housing situation. She and my dad started dating, and after about 8 months, they got married. Before Veronica came into the picture, my dad mostly ignored me. After she arrived, that changed, just not in the way I had hoped. Instead of just being cold, he and Veronica became downright mean. From the very start, she made it clear that she did not like me, and I never understood why. I never did anything to her, and I always tried to be polite. But she acted like she hated me just for existing. I can only guess that I was an unwanted reminder that my dad had a life before her. Maybe she just did not like the idea of having a teenage stepson around. Or maybe she was just that kind of person, someone who enjoyed making others miserable. Whatever the reason, she despised me, and my life became a nightmare. She went out of her way to make me miserable. Whenever we were in the same room, she treated me like a servant, constantly ordering me around. We had a maid, but that did not stop her from making me do all the housework. My dad never stood up for me. I felt like I was living in a twisted version of Cinderella. Then she convinced my father to stop giving me money. Before that, if I wanted to go out with my friends, I could at least ask my dad for a little cash. But Veronica put an end to that. She told him I was old enough to start earning my own money, that I needed to learn responsibility. That was the end of it. If I wanted to go anywhere or do anything, I had to get a job. There was no way I was going to beg my father to treat me like a normal human being, so I took a part-time job just so I could afford the basics. Veronica made my life hell, and my father let her. The only thing that kept me going was knowing that once I graduated, I could go to college and leave that house for good. I told my grandfather what was going on. He said he would talk to my dad, try to make things better. But nothing changed. Eventually, I stopped hoping. If my father had not changed by then, he never would. My grandfather listened when I needed to talk, but that was all he could do. I knew I just had to hold out until I could leave. Then, my birthday came. I had been planning to go out with my friends, grab a few beers, and finally have a night where I did not have to think about my father and Veronica. I had been saving money for a while, and I was looking forward to it. But of course, my dad and Veronica had other plans. That morning, they told me they had something important to talk about. For a split second, I actually thought maybe, just maybe, they remembered my birthday. Maybe they had something good to say, maybe they were going to offer to help with college. Instead, they told me I had to leave. They were kicking me out. Veronica had found out a few weeks ago that she was pregnant, and they decided my room would be the nursery. My dad claimed they had thought about it for a long time and that I should not bother begging or making a scene because their decision was final. They wanted to keep the good energy and did not want me ruining their happiness. Veronica chimed in, pretending to be all supportive, saying this was actually a good thing for me, that now I could be independent and start my own life. But all I could hear was her satisfaction in getting rid of me. I was panicking inside, but I knew that yelling or crying would not do anything. These people had no sympathy for me. So, I stayed calm and told them they could not legally evict me without notice. I told them they had to give me time to find a place. I had no idea if that was actually true, but it was the only thing I could think of. My dad was not fooled. He told me he had already talked to his lawyer, and besides, I did not have the money to take legal action. He was right, I had no way to fight this. Then I suggested paying rent if I stayed. Veronica immediately shot that down, saying it was not about money. She just did not want me there at all. She wanted peace and quiet for her pregnancy. I was desperate. I even asked if I could move into the basement. My dad still said no. He had a good job at a bank. He made more than enough money. Veronica had even quit working because he could support her. So I knew this was not about finances. They just wanted me gone. At that moment, I realized there was nothing I could do. I could not change their minds. Now that I was legally an adult, they could throw me out, and there was nothing stopping them. So, I gave up. I went to my room, packed my things, and left. I did not know if my grandfather could take me in. One of the reasons I never moved in with him before was that he struggled financially. He had been a high school science teacher, but he was retired now. Years ago, he had a gambling problem that wiped out his savings, and he relied on my dad for help. He could barely support himself, let alone me. That was why I had stayed. But now, I had no other choice. I did not know what else to do, so I went straight to my grandfather's house. When I got there, I told him everything. For the past year, I had been trying not to think about it, but deep down, I always knew this day would come. Now that I was officially on my own, I had no idea how I was going to afford college. Fall classes were only a couple of months away, and I had no plan. The thought of it all, being kicked out, having no financial support, and my future being up in the air, was too much to handle. I broke down. Seeing me like that must have pushed my grandfather over the edge. He sat there for a moment, watching me, then shook his head like he had finally had enough. "I should have done this years ago," he muttered. I had no idea what he meant. He did not explain anything. Instead, he got up and walked into the next room to make a phone call. I sat there, wiping my face, trying to listen, but I could not hear much. After an hour and a half of silence, I gave up and waited. When he finally came back, his expression was different, serious, determined. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "You don't have to worry about anything anymore. You are staying here with me. And college? That is taken care of too." I was stunned. I asked him what was going on, but he waved me off. "It is none of your concern right now," he said. There was something in his voice, something heavy. He was upset, more than I had ever seen him before. I wanted to press him for answers, but I let it go. Then, in a complete shift, he told me to stop sulking and go out with my friends like I had planned. "You are 18 today," he said. "Go have fun. Do not waste your birthday thinking about this." I hesitated, but he insisted. So, I went. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself relax. My phone stayed on silent the entire night. I did not want my father ruining my mood, the way he had ruined the rest of my day. I did not check my phone until I got back to my grandfather's house around 10 that night. That was when I saw the missed calls and unread messages. Something about it felt off. My father, who had barely spoken to me unless necessary, was suddenly blowing up my phone, begging me to come back. I ignored him at first. The next morning, I finally answered. I sent one simple text, "I am not coming back." And I did not sugarcoat it. I told him the truth, he never treated me like a son. He never showed me love or care, and I was finally free. There was no way I was giving up my chance at happiness just to go back to a house where I was treated like a burden. And Veronica? She was worse than him. There was no way I was putting myself through that again. For years, he controlled my life, but I was an adult now. I had the right to decide where I lived. He had kicked me out just the day before. He did not get to turn around and act like he wanted me back. I had been worried about my grandfather, but since he was okay with me staying, there was no reason for me to ever return to my father's house. After I sent my message, he responded with a long, dramatic text. He told me he had spent the night thinking. He had gone through some old photo albums in his office and started reminiscing about the promises he had made to my mother. He said he felt like he had failed her by putting Veronica and their unborn child ahead of me. Now, he wanted another chance. He claimed that the pregnancy had thrown him off, and that was why he had blindly followed Veronica's wishes. But now he realized that kicking me out was wrong, and he desperately wanted me back. I did not respond. I saw right through it. I knew he was trying to manipulate me, but what I did not understand was why. What was he trying to gain? It had been a week since I left, and he was still messaging me every single day. He kept bringing up memories from when I was younger, moments when he had actually acted like a father, and kept apologizing for the way he treated me. At first, I was sure he was just playing a game. But now, I was not sure. I talked to my grandfather about it, hoping he would have some insight. He just shook his head and said, "Do not fall for it." The way he said it, like he had no doubt in his mind, made me wonder what he knew that I did not. I started feeling guilty. I knew leaving was the right decision. Every logical part of my brain told me that. But another part of me, the part that had spent my whole life craving my father's love, wondered if maybe, just maybe, he really did want to change. Why else would he keep trying? He had to know Veronica would hate it if I came back. Yet, he was still reaching out, still trying to convince me to return. I kept thinking about it, wondering if I owed him a second chance. Then, yesterday, I got another message. He told me he would get down on his knees and beg if that was what it took for me to come home. And I felt bad. But even then, I did not respond. And the guilt is eating me up inside. So, am I the bad guy for refusing to go back, even though my father is practically begging me? Update 1. I am not going back to my father's house, and I doubt he meant a single word he said. I finally realized that his sudden desperation to bring me back had nothing to do with me. It was all about his lifestyle and keeping things comfortable for himself. I sat my grandfather down and told him everything. I told him how my father had been begging me to come home, how he was sending message after message, trying to convince me he had changed. I admitted that, despite knowing better, it was making me feel guilty. I had talked to my grandfather about this before, but he always brushed it off, warning me not to fall for it. This time, I needed to get everything off my chest. Even if he could not help, I just had to say it out loud. When I finished talking, my grandfather's whole demeanor changed. He got serious in a way I had never seen before. Then he told me something that changed everything. He said he was never supposed to tell me this, but he felt like I had a right to know. He told me that, from the time I was a child, my father never paid for anything when it came to me. Everything, my food, my clothes, my schooling, was covered by my mother's side of the family. Now that my father had kicked me out, my grandfather had finally spoken to them, letting them know how I had been treated all these years. That was why they decided I needed to live with him now. They were furious with him, too, for staying silent all these years, for letting my father treat me like an afterthought without stepping in sooner. But now, they made it clear I would not be going back. My father had no idea about any of this. He had always assumed that my grandfather was the one providing money for me. My grandfather had never corrected him because he knew my father despised my mother's family. If he found out where the money was really coming from, he would have refused to take it, and I would have suffered because of it. So, my grandfather let him believe the lie. My mother's family was wealthy. They sent a lot of money over the years, which was the only reason I was able to attend private school. My father would have never spent that kind of money on me himself. But everything changed after he married Veronica. Once she was in the picture, my father stopped using the money for me. Instead, he pocketed it. Meanwhile, he forced me to get a job just so I could afford basic things, clothes when I outgrew my old ones, a night out with friends every once in a while. My grandfather never told my mother's side about any of this. He was afraid of how they would react. He was afraid they might take legal action or cut off contact completely, and then he would never get to see me again. So, he kept quiet. But when my father threw me out, he could not stay silent anymore. I was angry at my grandfather for keeping this from me for so long. But then he told me why my mother's family had insisted on secrecy. They did not want me to know where the money was coming from because they knew I would want to meet them. And they did not want to meet me. Not because they did not care. Not because they did not love me. But because, according to them, I looked too much like my mother. They could not bear to see me, to be reminded of what they had lost. It was emotional, not logical. I was still upset, though. My grandfather had seen what my father and Veronica were putting me through, and he said nothing. I asked him why. He admitted he was afraid. He thought that if he told the truth, my mother's family would take control of the situation and have me placed with someone else. He thought they might take me away completely. And if that happened, he would never get to see me again. It was irrational, but fear does not always make sense. We talked it through, and even though I am still processing all of it, at least now I know the truth. And I know for sure I am never going back to my father's house. He is not suddenly filled with regret. He is not trying to fix his mistakes. He is trying to get me back so my mother's family will continue sending him money. It was never about me. It was always about him. Update 2. After learning the truth, I blocked my father's number. I was done with him. That did not stop him, though. A couple of days passed, and suddenly, I started getting messages from an unfamiliar number. It was Veronica. She even called me. I answered by accident. I did not have her number saved. The moment I heard her voice, I wanted to hang up. But curiosity got the best of me. She was crying. Or at least, she was pretending to. Through fake sobs, she told me my father was devastated. She said he was miserable without me and that she could not stand to see him like this, especially in her condition. She said it like she was dying from some terrible disease. I told her I had no interest in talking to her. So, she handed the phone to my father. I could hear him taking a breath like he was about to start one of his long-winded speeches. But I cut him off before he could even say a word. I told him to stop pretending. I told him I knew the truth. And I was not going to fall for it. He acted confused. Said he did not know what I was talking about. So, I told him that maybe my mother's family could explain it better. Then, I hung up. And I blocked Veronica's number too. It felt good to finally throw it back at them. My grandfather said I handled it the right way. I think so too. Update 3. I just got back from meeting my mother's family for the first time. And I am happy to say it went well. My grandfather was with me the entire time, which helped. I was nervous. But when I finally saw them, I knew I had nothing to be afraid of. My grandparents were kind people. And my uncle? He was just like me, only older. The moment we saw each other, we all got emotional. Some tears were shed, which probably made things awkward for the other people at the restaurant. But we did not care. We were finally together. Once we got past the emotions, they started asking me questions about my life, my interests. And they actually listened. They actually cared. Then they told me I had nothing to worry about when it came to college. They had already set everything up. Apparently, they had forgotten to mention that part to my grandfather. That was a huge relief. We had a great time together, and before we left, they told me they wanted to meet regularly. They promised we would see each other every month. Either I would fly out to visit them, or they would come see me. But we would keep in touch. And for the first time in my life, I feel like I actually have a family that wants me. And I cannot even begin to explain how much that means to me.